I have known Professor Tsai for over 25 years now, and I first met him about 25 years ago in Shandong when he had just started the Baha'i Research Center at the university where he was teaching. And so 25 years of inspiration from Professor Tsai and his research work. And it's been always a pleasure to talk to him. And recently, of course, his research on Hu Shi, a prominent Chinese philosopher, essayist, diplomat, and a key contributor to Chinese liberalism and reform of written vernacular Chinese, as well as he can be considered the father of China New Culture movement, which we'll talk about a little bit. I think that listening to Professor Tsai today and his very comprehensive sort of perspective on the different aspects of Hu Shi's life and his influence by the Baha'i writings and the Baha'i friends he was surrounded with while he was at Cornell and Columbia University in New York. It's really wonderful. I had a opportunity, of course, to talk to Professor Tsai on several occasions about this research. And so I have made some notes that I would like to share with you. Basically, Hu Shi can be considered a visionary in a very turbulent time in China's history as well as world history. He was born at the time, 1891, and by the time that he was in his teens, the world was in a state of transition. China was in transition in terms of the Qing dynasty and the Republic of China. There was a progressive movement here in the US in response to industrialization and urbanization, political corruption. There were tensions in Europe as a result of the militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism that led to World War I. So him moving to New York in 1910 to study at Cornell, it really represents a kind of a turning point, you can say, that in his life. While he was studying at Cornell, that he encountered a number of Baha'is in the New York community, namely Cao Yunxiang, who was going to become the father of Tsinghua University, as well as Gilbert Reed, a missionary who spent about 47 years of his life in China, was fluent in Chinese, his Chinese name Li Jiabai, and a number of other people. He was also in New York at the time when Abdul Baha, the son of the Prophet, founder of the Baha'i faith, visited the US, and he spent a good deal of time in New York. Here, maybe we need to say a little bit about the Baha'i faith and the Baha'i writings, a young religion that it had its origins in the 19th century Persia, with a central message of the unity of mankind and talking about the progressive nature of religion, that we have gone through the different stages of development, from family to tribe to city-state to now to country, and subsequently now we're heading towards a global civilization. Hu Shi clearly was moved by the Baha'i vision of the oneness of humankind and the establishment of an ever-advancing civilization. So Tsai Jiao using the word Baha'i civilization is a very good description of what the what Baha'i faith is all about, because it cannot be really compared to your traditional past religions because we're living in a very different time today. And we're going to talk about that a little bit and about professors' research. So we talked about the fact that that Hushe in New York, he was not only influenced by his close friends, whether it was Cao Yunxiang or other Chinese friends who were studying also at that point, but also that during the visit of Abdul Baha, as we were looking at some of the newspapers, and that there was quite a bit of reporting about Abdul Baha giving talks in various churches, synagogues, different occasions. It was a new message. Abdul Baha was bringing this message of globalism at a time that maybe the world was not really, was not really connected in that way. Today, when we look at how we're connected across the planet, globalism seems like a natural sort of conclusion. But 100 years ago, back in the 1910s, in the US, this was still a fairly novel idea. Talking about Cao Yunxiang, the father of Tsinghua University, who translated many of the Baha'i writings, as well as embracing the Baha'i faith. And somebody asked earlier that if Hushe had become a Baha'i or he had accepted the Baha'i faith. As far as we know from his writings, he was highly influenced by the writings of the Baha'i faith. But as far as we know, he did not embrace the faith in the sense of what we call declaring to become a declared Baha'i. But it seems like his heart was touched by the message and he wrote about it. Hushe is also, Hushe's writing in this period, we can see that it really reflects on the Baha'i vision of global unity and peace. And so I believe that from Professor Tsai's research, that there seems to be a kind of a reaction or resonating, Hushe resonating with this message, resonating with the Baha'i message. And of course, Mr. Naismith, who spent quite a bit of time with Hushe and had met Abdul Baha and was very knowledgeable about the Baha'i faith, we believe that he was a great source of information and giving Hushe a perspective on the Baha'i writings. Hushe returned to China in 1917, and he basically moved by the Baha'i vision of globalism and integration of the Eastern and Western civilization, as well as the pragmatic kind of approach or pragmatism inspired by John Dewey. So Hushe becomes really one of the leaders of the May 4th movement that was about anti-imperialism. He becomes literally the father of New Culture movement, which was basically against old practices and trying to move China towards more democracy and more scientific research in line with what was happening in the West. So teaching at the Beijing University, and here we're talking about Hushe's, encounter with Mao Zedong, who I believe at that point he was working at the library, but Hushe became sort of a mentor for Mao Zedong. As Professor mentioned, that the quote, Baha'i quote, "The earth is but one country and mankind is citizens," which was told by Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith. uh, it resonated with Mao quite a bit. And actually, it's interesting that today in Tiananmen Square on the wall, we see the words "Long live the unity of the people of the world." And so when you compare that the communist message of 为人民服务, you know, just serving the people, meaning the people probably of China, here we're using the word the people of the world. So it's a much broader concept. Um, the other thing that it seems like had inspired Mao was the Baha'i concept of independent investigation of truth, and how that became the foundation of the Independent Study University in Hunan, which Professor Tsai talked about. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about Cao Yunxiang. Professor Tsai has written a 2-volume set about Cao Yunxiang, the father of Tsinghua University, who embraced the Baha'i faith while he was studying in the US. And he returned to China to become the head of the Tsinghua School in 1922, and then later on establishing it as a university in 1925. And looking at some of those early years of the establishment of the university, that Cao Yunxiang definitely was looking at establishing the university with a great deal of the Baha'i concepts and the Baha'i vision of globalism. And of course, the spirit of Yale, where he studied. And of course, Tsinghua University was bound to become one of the leading universities in China and eventually in the world. At the same time, Hu Shi, teaching at Beijing University, and according to one account, that he was he's leading in some sense the development of Beijing University. That's another dimension. So two of the highest institutions of higher learning in China, highly influenced by and inspired by the Baha'i writings. So now we're addressing the idea of public health and globalism. I think in this pandemic, this is becoming more and more clear that some of Hu Shi's writing and the inspiration from the Baha'i writings in terms of the Eastern and Western civilization embracing each other, a global civilization, talking about a new world order and departure from old practices based on nationalism. So public health definition as something that is about the entire body of society. And today we're talking about the entire global community. And we're seeing that how the fragmented approach to address public health in various countries is not working as well as various countries would have hoped for. We're seeing it here in the US and in other parts of the world. And there is a great deal of uncertainty about whether we're able, as a global community, able to get this pandemic under control. So that interdependence, it can be seen in Hu Shi's perspective, that is also a part of the Baha'i concept of a global community, a global society. The other part of it was that Hu Shi talked about, that the Eastern and Western medicine should be integrated to address health. And that's another aspect of Hu Shi's writing that is quite interesting. The Baha'i concept of world civilization, also it appears in Hu Shi's proposal for a full globalization, and Eastern and Western civilization must complement each other, an integrated approach And I'm going to here take it a little bit further and talk about the three perspectives of the social, economic, and ecological aspect of this integration. Um, Professor Tai talked about the Confucian Code of Conduct, acquiring virtues, and the Golden Rule, and the Baha'i concept of spiritual development of individual as necessary element of the advancement of civilization and global unity, family being the basic unit of society, and what happens in the family, it reflects across the society. The concept of a world citizen that is becoming very popular now, I think that it could be very much traced back to this aspect of the global community, and that our responsibility goes way beyond nationalistic fervor. Um, Professor Tsai, of course, talked about Professor Ji Xianling, who was a well-known Chinese scholar and Professor Tsai's mentor, in essence, and where Professor Tsai has written extensively about Ji Xianling. And Ji Xianling's writing about the influence of Hu Shi in the late Qing dynasty and the early Republic of China is quite interesting to read. With our limited time, we're not going to be able to touch upon that, but it's quite extensive. And that shows the impact of Hu Shi on Chinese philosophers and Chinese scholars in the last 100 years. Finally, looking at the social perspective of the sort of addressing the global pandemic, Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, talks about the need for global governance and coordination of the global communities through some kind of a global government to address the current pandemic. And we might eventually have to get to that point at some time moving forward. I was just reading that they are predicting at CDC that this coming fall, we can expect the situation to get more serious. The other perspective that I wanted to also bring out, based on what Professor Tsai has shared today, and it's quite interesting, is that the economic perspective or the economic element in this picture that, and the Baha'i concept of spiritual solution to economic problems and the current global crisis, we're seeing how a social disarray or social fragmentation can lead to economic disaster, and how various countries, they're really trying to deal with the economic impact of the pandemic. And therefore, it makes more sense to have some kind of a global consultation on moving forward, so we're able to address the needs of the current state of crisis. There are several statements from the Baha'i international community, namely prosperity of humankind and who is writing the future, that we have been sharing systematically on through WeChat and among various groups. It's very enlightening looking at the concept of prosperity from many different perspectives, not just primarily as supply and demand, or just prosperity for a small group of people, but the large majority of the world population is in dire strait in terms of whether dealing with the pandemic or the economic impact, or just traditionally not having access to the basic necessities of life, or what I call basic prosperity. The other part of it is that the work stress and the need for changes in business ethics and reducing stress from work, which seems to be quite pronounced here in the US and in other parts of the world. that we kind of, we see that as an opportunity to make changes in every aspect of our lives so that with the given situation, with the pandemic, uh, uh, sort of expanding, or with the pandemic taking on new dimensions, that we're able to also make adjustment that would have impact on our own health and our immune system. Um, we talked a little bit about an educated public in choosing, products and services. Um, and I think this idea of supply and demand and the traditional model of market economy, we are coming to the conclusion that it's not effective in the sense of really addressing the needs of our, whether it's social or environmental issues that are we're dealing with. On the environmental perspective, the third element, we talked about social and economic, that also we see the Baha'i perspective on nature and human beings as custodians of Earth, that this is a trust, and that we should do our best to preserve it and to protect it. The need for reducing consumption, protecting the environment and conserving resources to address climate change and global warming, which is impacting our economy and it's impacting our global community. The Guardian of the Baha'i Faith talks about that Professor Tsai actually shared this quote in Chinese, and I read it to you, quote, "Man is organic with the world. His inner life molds the environment and is itself also deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of man is the result of these mutual reactions." To finally bring the my short talk to conclusion, that I believe that we are looking to create a global community and look at the public health issues, as was mentioned by Professor Tai in his research on Hu Shi, that we need to look at the many dimensions of public health and what affects public health around the world, namely the social balance, the economic balance, and the ecological balance. The social balance in terms of developing and teaching moral education in our schools. The unity of our global community, seeing ourselves as global citizens. Economic balance in terms of empowerment of our young generation, and making sure that the entire population of the earth has access to the basic prosperity in terms of having access to food and water, having access to shelter, education, and eventually jobs and good health. And the ecological balance, of course, I think is very well received nowadays, and people, they are in agreement that we need conservation and the protection of our natural resources that would lead to good health as another dimension of our endeavor as a global society. I want to thank Professor Boynton and also Professor Tsai for this wonderful book and for giving me an opportunity here to be able to present this short talk. Thank you.
All right.